Hi, my name's Jake Whitehead, and I'm the Head of Policy at the Electric Vehicle Council. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague Natalie, who's our Senior Manager of Policy. Today, we're delving into how electric vehicles compare with traditional internal combustion engine vehicles like petrol and diesel vehicles in terms of their life cycle emissions. So, Nat, to kick us off, let's start with the basics for our audience. What are life cycle emissions and why are they important?
A great question, Jake. So, life cycle emissions encompass the complete range of emissions associated with a vehicle from cradle to grave. So, that's from its initial production through to its end of life processing. For EVs, that includes both the extraction and processing of raw materials for the manufacturing of batteries and vehicles, as well as the emissions related to electricity used during the operational use phase of the vehicle through to the recycling process at end of life. For internal combustion engine vehicles or ICE vehicles, while they may not involve emissions associated with making a battery, a critical aspect of an ICE vehicle's life cycle emissions is the production and combustion of fuel, which contributes significantly to their overall emissions. It's important that when you look at the emissions associated with a vehicle, you can understand the full life cycle so you can accurately assess the full footprint and environmental impact of our transport choices.
And I think that last point you made, Natalie, is really important because more and more people are wanting to understand the emissions associated with their different transport choices and how in the future they might be able to make choices that ultimately are more environmentally friendly. And that really leads us to where we are right now with the Electric Vehicle Council launching our latest initiative, a life cycle emissions calculator. This is part of a broader EV consumer hub that we've launched at learn.evc.org.au. And specifically with this calculator, we're aiming to help provide greater transparency on the emissions of different vehicle types, including electric vehicles. Now, when we came to develop this tool, we collaborated very closely with the EU transport experts, Transport and Environment. They built a similar tool for the European market, and we've been able to tailor that using Australian vehicle data and electricity data to be able to compare the emissions of electric, hybrid, and petrol vehicles. It's really important to us that this calculator is evidence-based and that the assumptions are robust and transparent. And whilst this calculator does only provide average estimates for different sized vehicles and doesn't give you specific estimates for individual makes and models, we're hoping that this is a great first step in being able to encourage more manufacturers to produce their own life cycle assessments of their vehicles, and also for everyday Australians to be able to understand the emissions of different vehicle types. So Natalie, could you help viewers understand some of the factors that affect EV emissions specifically?
Sure thing. So for EVs, battery production is a significant factor. That's because extracting raw materials like lithium, cobalt, and nickel can be quite energy intensive, and associated emissions are quite high at the moment as supply chains continue to decarbonize. After that, the manufacturing of the batteries themselves depends on the energy mix involved in production, which does vary from region to region. Then, during the operational use phase of a vehicle, the source of electricity used to power an EV will have a defining factor in terms of assessing fuel life cycle emissions. The cleaner the energy source, the lower the overall emissions. So, for example, EVs charged using solar power have a much smaller emissions footprint than those using electricity from a fossil fuel powered grid. When we look beyond that to end of life, there are obviously a number of different factors to consider. At the moment, EV battery recycling is still a nascent industry, so we haven't fully incorporated the potential benefits of a circular value chain for battery materials, including both recycling and second life applications. So instead, in our tool, our consideration of end of life is applied across all powertrains, applying a conservative recycling credit to acknowledge the emissions saved by avoiding the need for new material extraction.
So, clearly there's quite a bit of complexity here in being able to understand the emissions over that life cycle and across those different stages. It's not a simple task, right? And, understandably, As a result, I think there's often debate about the reliability of these kinds of assessments. There's different assumptions that need to be built in, and also there's regardless of the approach you take, there's always some level of uncertainty. At the end of the day, these are estimates, but they should be based on robust evidence to help provide a reasonable indication of what those life cycle emissions are. I think, specifically when we talk about our calculator, I'm sure some will have questions about, has the data been cherry picked to make EVs look better? What I can say is, as a transport scientist, someone who has worked in this field for well over a decade, I know just how important it is that work like our calculator is transparent, evidence-based, and underpinned by those robust assumptions. And specifically in the case of our life cycle emissions calculator, we've chosen to purposefully take a conservative approach in order to show some of the worst case scenarios for EVs relative to other vehicle types. And that's in large part because we want to be clear that we are not building in some kind of rosy, unrealistic scenario for this technology. Could you explain to us a little bit further, Natalie, how we've taken that conservative approach in building this calculator?
Absolutely. So to begin with, while we know that the EVs that are being sold into the Australian market do come from all over the world, for the purposes of being a bit more straightforward, we've assumed that in this calculator, the average EV comes from China, with battery factories using grid average electricity with slightly higher emissions than other parts of the world. Beyond that, obviously, when we look at the operational phase of an EV, we've included the electricity grid decarbonising gradually over time. However, we haven't factored in that a typical EV owner may optimise their charging to maximise renewable energy use. And instead, we've assumed the average generation mix over the life of that vehicle. In addition, so when we look actually beyond EVs to, ICE vehicles, while we have, seen international studies that show that hybrids have higher production emissions over conventional petrol vehicles, about 5 to 7% higher, we haven't included that in this calculator, which then presents a bit more of an optimistic scenario for hybrids versus a conservative scenario for EVs. And so, as you've said, we've made a few of these conservative assumptions to show that even when we take the worst case scenario, we're still better off choosing EVs today.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. I hope that that's been very helpful for those of you tuned in to understand what's behind this calculator and the different assumptions we've made. Coming back to you, Nat, could you briefly show us how the calculator works and how people can use it to better understand typical life cycle emissions?
Absolutely. So the tool itself is quite straightforward. So a user has to just select a few different inputs to then compare different cars across different segments and powertrains. So to begin with, the first step is to select your state or territory, or you can look at Australia for the life cycle emissions associated with the national electricity market and the eastern states. And so I'm going to do that for this example. After that, you just have to choose the cars to compare. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to select a medium SUV, which is a very obviously popular vehicle segment in Australia. And I'm going to compare that with a petrol equivalent as well as a hybrid version as well. And so as you can see here with the results shown, what you first get is the grams of CO2 emissions per kilometre. So when you're driving the vehicle, what's the average CO2 emissions per kilometre? As we can see with medium SUV is 121 grams, the petrol vehicle is 279 grams, and a hybrid is slightly better at 211 grams. What you can then see is the total cumulative emissions in tonnes of CO2 across the life cycle of that vehicle. And so what you can see here is that obviously EVs are considerably lower than both hybrids and petrol vehicles, being over 50% lower using just grid electricity across the national electricity market compared to a petrol vehicle equivalent. When we then factor in the use of rooftop solar, it becomes an even obviously better scenario for EVs because it reduces those total life cycle emissions per kilometre to 74 grams CO2 per kilometre. And over the life of that vehicle, it's significantly lower again, and it becomes a over 70% improvement on petrol equivalents. So that's a bit of a quick overview of this calculator. Obviously, you can do a bit more with this. You can compare different vehicles across different segments if you wish to. You can compare different powertrains as well. You can compare several EVs and several hybrids, up to 4, and you can obviously then select different jurisdictions as well to see what that looks like using different grid emissions as well. But that's a quick overview for you.
Thanks so much, Nat. And I think it's really interesting the results from this, that even with those relatively conservative assumptions that are built in to the calculations, overall across those segments, EVs are still providing significantly lower life cycle emissions than both petrol and hybrid vehicles, even when charged from the grid today. Certainly, I think we can see that hybrids are better than petrol vehicles and a step in the right direction, but generally that reduction really seems to be only about half what EVs can deliver when charged using the grid, and then even less when charged using renewable energy. So I think clearly we're seeing hybrids do have a role to play in the near term, but as many international groups have highlighted, the data is showing they are not a long-term solution for achieving climate targets, including net zero, and electric vehicles are a clear leader in terms of maximising that reduction in transport emissions. So from your perspective, Nat, what are some of the big takeaway findings for people that are considering an electric vehicle?
So as we've seen, EVs are already today a really key contributor to reducing vehicle emissions across the transport space. And it's actually not the end of the story. So as we move towards a greener grid, the benefits of EVs in terms of emissions reduction will only grow, making them a really essential part in achieving our climate targets and improving our environmental footprints.
Yeah. No, I think this is really important for everyone that is, interested in buying an electric vehicle, or maybe you already own an electric vehicle, but you're wanting to find out more. And the exciting thing is that the Electric Vehicle Council has our consumer hub at learn.evc.org.au, which has a broad range of other tools and resources in addition to this life cycle emissions calculator, where you can find out more about electric vehicle technology, understand what incentives are available for purchasing an EV, or understand what different policies the council is advocating for to see more EVs in Australia. And importantly, of course, also understand what electric vehicles are available in Australia today. So, coming back to the life cycle emissions calculator, I just want to highlight to those of you tuned in that it's important to understand these findings align and are consistent with independent studies that have been carried out by international experts, such as the International Council on Clean Transportation, Transport and Environment, and even studies commissioned directly by the EU Parliament. Time and time again, we're seeing that EVs are a critical technology, arguably the most critical technology for decarbonising transport, even based on today's electricity grid. We know that over time that grid is becoming cleaner, and so we can't afford to delay in this transition. We need to actively support the uptake of electric vehicles from now in order to capture and take advantage of that significant reduction in emissions. If we don't, we'll simply be shifting that burden onto farmers, households and manufacturers in order to cut their emissions harder and faster, and I simply don't think that's fair. Importantly, I think we also need to recognise that EVs are powered using 100% Australian-made energy, instead of being dependent on incredibly expensive imported fuel. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's a clear benefit, an economic benefit for our country, where we can support local energy jobs through this technology. And so with that, we might wrap up here. Thank you so much for joining us to learn more about our life cycle emissions calculator. We're really excited for you to have the opportunity to use it and learn more about vehicle emissions from all different types of vehicles. And please remember to visit our consumer hub at learn.evc.org.au for more information. Thanks again, and we hope you have a great day.